The fate of a devastated salt mining town in eastern Ukraine hung in the balance Wednesday in one of the bloodiest battles of Russia's invasion, while Ukraine's unflagging resistance and other challenges prompted Moscow to shake up its military leadership again. Russian forces used jets, mortars and rockets to bombard Soledar in an unrelenting assault. Soldar's fall, while unlikely a turning point in the nearly 11-month war, would be a prize for a Kremlin starved of good battlefield news in recent months. It would also offer Russian troops a springboard to conquer other areas of Donetsk province that remain under Ukrainian control, such as the nearby strategic city of Bakhmut. Donetsk and neighboring Luhansk province, which together make up the Donbass region bordering Russia, were Moscow's main stated territorial targets in invading Ukraine, but the fighting has settled mostly into a stalemate. In an apparent recognition of battlefield setbacks, Russia's defense ministry announced the demotion of the head of Russian forces in Ukraine after only 3 months on the job. Russia's top military officer, the chief of the military's general staff, General Valery Gerasimov, was named as the replacement for General Sergei Surovikin, who was demoted to deputy. During his short time overseeing the troops in Ukraine, Surovikin was credited with strengthening coordination, reinforcing control and introducing a campaign to knock out Ukraine's public utilities as a pressure tactic. But he also announced a humiliating withdrawal in November from Kherson, the only regional center Russian forces had captured just weeks after the Kremlin illegally annexed the area. His demotion signaled that Russian President Vladimir Putin wasn't fully satisfied with his performance. Gerasimov, meanwhile, was seen as the top architect of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and critics have blamed him for Moscow's military setbacks. On the battlefield, a Ukrainian officer, near Soledar, told the Associated Press the pattern is that first the Russians send 1 or 2 waves of soldiers, many from the private Russian military contractor Wagner Group, who take heavy casualties as they probe the Ukrainian defenses. When Ukrainian troops suffer casualties and are exhausted, the Russians send a fresh wave of highly trained soldiers, paratroopers or special forces, said the Ukrainian officer, who insisted on anonymity for security reasons. Ukrainian officials denied Russian claims that Soledar had fallen, but the Wagner Group's owner repeated the assertion of a breakthrough late Wednesday. Ukraine's military said late Wednesday Russian forces had suffered huge losses in the Soledar fighting. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov stopped short of declaring the municipality's capture, telling reporters Russian forces had achieved a positive dynamics in advancing in Soledar. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky weighed in Wednesday in his nightly video address. Now the terrorist state and its propagandists are trying to pretend that some part of our city of Soledar, a city that was almost completely destroyed by the occupiers, is allegedly some kind of Russia's achievement. He said Ukrainian forces in the area are holding out against the Russians. Soledar, known for salt mining and processing, has little intrinsic value, but it lies at a strategic point 10 kilometers, 6 miles, north of the city of Bakhmut, which Russian forces want to surround. Taking Bakhmut would disrupt Ukraine's supply lines and open a route for the Russians to press toward Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, Ukrainian strongholds in Donetsk province. The Wagner Group, which now reportedly includes a large contingent of convicts recruited in Russian prisons and constitutes up to a quarter of all Russian combatants in Ukraine, has spearheaded the attack on Soledar and Bakhmut. Delivering victory in Soledar and Bakhmut after months of Russian frontline difficulties would help Prigozhin, who has criticized Gerasimov, increase his clout in what has emerged as somewhat of a rivalry with Russia's military leadership. An exceptional feature of the fighting near Bakhmut is that some has taken place around entrances to disused salt mine tunnels, which run for some 200 kilometers, 120 miles, according to Western intelligence reports. Putin claimed Wednesday that Russia had successfully resisted Western pressure, especially sanctions, over its invasion of Ukraine, and vowed that his country has enough resources to beef up its military while continuing social programs. Polish President Andrzej Duda said his country is willing to send German-made Leopard tanks to help Ukraine as part of a larger international coalition. Duda spoke after meeting in Lviv with Zelensky, who said Ukraine needs tanks to win the war. In Britain, another staunch Ukraine ally, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's spokesman said no final decision has been made whether to send tanks. Russia and Ukraine have agreed on an exchange of 40 prisoners of war each, Russian Human Rights Commissioner Tatyana Moskalkova said on Wednesday after meeting her Ukrainian counterpart Dmytro Lubinets in Turkey. Moskalkova and Lubinets were meeting on the sidelines of an international ombudsman conference in Ankara. Photos showed them sitting on opposite sides of a table. Russia and Ukraine have conducted numerous prisoner swaps, most recently on Sunday, amounting to hundreds of captives each in the course of the war, which is now in its 11th month. In a separate press appearance, Lubinets said the swap agreed on Wednesday was part of a broader arrangement by which both sides regularly exchange prisoners but underscored that they had not signed any official agreements. Lubinets added that the Ukrainian side had voiced, among other issues, its concerns over alleged Russian violations of the Geneva Convention in its treatment of Ukrainian POWs. Earlier, Moskova said on the Telegram messaging app that she and Lubinets had also discussed the issue of servicemen missing on both sides, and civilian humanitarian issues. She said she had asked Lubinets to help Ukrainian citizens who want to visit relatives in Russia. Given the current difficulty of establishing humanitarian corridors inside Ukraine, Moskova said the ombudsman should help specific people to move between regions and countries, saying Turkey could play an important role. Separately, Russia's state-owned RIA news agency quoted Moskova as saying, important words about the need for a ceasefire in Ukraine had been spoken during her meeting with her Ukrainian and Turkish colleagues. Moskova said a ceasefire was necessary to stop human rights violations, RIA reported. She also asked Turkey, a NATO ally, to stop supplying arms to Ukraine. As Moskova and Lubinets met in Ankara, a fierce battle was raging for the small town of Soldar in eastern Ukraine. Both were later due to visit the Turkish presidential palace, where President Tayyip Erdogan was scheduled to make a speech for the conference. Evidence of the wholesale slaughter of Ukrainian civilians has been found in areas that were previously under occupation by Russian invasion forces. In total, 21 mass graves have been found in the territories liberated from the Russian invaders, including 3 in Donetsk Oblast. 278 civilians and 37 servicemen of the armed forces of Ukraine were exhumed, 14 in Kiev Oblast, 177 people were exhumed, 2 in Kharkiv Oblast, 451 civilians and 44 servicemen were exhumed, and 2 in Kherson Oblast, 46 people exhumed. The police reported that most of the dead had gunshot wounds and mine-explosive injuries. At the same time, the police clarified they do not keep track of the number of bodies of people killed due to the Russian invasion who were found in houses and on the streets in the liberated territories. Mikhailo Podolyak, the advisor to the head of the president's office, said on December 1 that the number of civilians killed in Ukraine due to Russian aggression could significantly exceed 20,000. As early as the spring of 2022, it was reported that more than 20,000 people could have been killed in the Russian-occupied city of Mariupol. Russian President Vladimir Putin on Wednesday appointed a new top commander of his forces in Ukraine in another shakeup of military leadership. The Russian Defense Ministry announced General Valery Gerasimov will be the next commander of the joint group of forces in Ukraine, replacing General Sergei Surovikin, who was appointed to the position in October. Surovikin was demoted to a deputy overseeing aerospace forces under Gerasimov. Gerasimov has served as the Chief of General Staff of Russia's armed forces since 2012. He is a veteran commander of the Second Chechen War and is considered a key figure in Russian military planning. Since launching its invasion of Ukraine last February, Russia has faced heavy losses and numerous setbacks in the war. Surovikin oversaw campaigns in Syria and was known for his ruthlessness. He was appointed over the fall to help Russia make more headway in the war in Ukraine. Russian forces are currently engaged in deadly fighting with Ukraine in the eastern region of the country. Russia's top military officer was put in charge of troops fighting in Ukraine on Wednesday, a move that appears to reflect the Kremlin's dissatisfaction with the current leadership and flaws in the military's performance. Russia's defense ministry said that General Valery Gerasimov, the chief of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces, was named the new commander of the unified group of forces in Ukraine. The previous commander, General Sergei Surovikin, was demoted to become Gerasimov's deputy along with 2 other generals. The reshuffle, which was formally ordered by Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, clearly came on Russian President Vladimir Putin's approval, signaling that he still has trust in his top military leaders who have faced broad criticism for the troops' performance in the conflict. While announcing Gerasimov's appointment, the Defense Ministry said it was aimed at improving coordination between various forces fighting in Ukraine. Surovikin was credited with strengthening coordination and reinforcing control over Russian forces in Ukraine after his appointment in October. His demotion to the number 2 role signaled that while Putin wasn't quite happy with his performance, he still trusts the general's expertise. Soon after Surovikin was appointed in October, Russian troops pulled back from the southern city of Kherson under the brunt of a Ukrainian counteroffensive. The retreat from the only regional center captured by Russia since it sent troops into Ukraine on February 24 came weeks after its annexation by Moscow and dealt a painful blow to the Kremlin. In his turn, Gerasimov, who was seen as the top architect of the Russian action in Ukraine as the country's top military officer in charge of strategic military planning, was also widely blamed for Moscow's military setbacks. Such criticism was also shared by Chechnya's leader, Ramzan Kadyrov, who deployed troops from his region to fight in Ukraine and repeatedly urged the Kremlin to up the ante in the conflict. The criticism of Gerasimov from Prigozhin and Kadyrov rose to a high pitch in September, when Russian troops were forced to pull back from Ukraine's northeastern region of Kharkiv by a swift Ukrainian counteroffensive. Kadyrov particularly accused Gerasimov of covering up for his protégé, Colonel General Alexander Lapin, who was in charge of the troops that retreated from the Kharkiv region. Despite such attacks, Lapin was promoted to become the Chief of Staff of Ground Forces earlier this week. His promotion along with Gerasimov's new appointment appear to signal that Prigozhin and Kadyrov have little influence over the Kremlin's decision-making despite their increasing public activity. Putin on Wednesday also gave a televised dressing down to Denis Manturov, a deputy prime minister in charge of aviation and other high-tech industries. Putin demanded that Manturov act more quickly in contracting new aircraft and cut him short during a televised video call with cabinet members when he tried to defend his performance. Ukraine fears Russia could build up forces on the territory of its ally Belarus before striking in the northwest or even try to drive towards Kiev as it did when it invaded last February. By reopening a northern front, Russia would stretch Kiev's forces, which have been focused for months on battles raging in the east and south, forcing it to divert troops to the north. Colonel Roman Volodchuk of the 104th Territorial Defense Brigade sought to project strength on the sidelines of military drills in 3 secret locations in Ukraine's northwest. Soldiers from his territorial defense unit, one of hundreds of militias raised shortly before Russia's February 24 invasion, said they were well prepared to face down any new threat. Anticipating what kind of attack Ukraine may face, Kiev's troops on Wednesday practiced urban warfare, firing assault rifles, driving armored vehicles and freeing hostages. Despite bringing colossal pressure onto the eastern town of Soledar in recent days, Russian forces have appeared on the back foot on the battlefield for months, and a sudden assault from Belarus would mark an astonishing change of dynamic. Konrad Muzyka, head of defense analysis firm Rokon Consulting, said a slow buildup of Russian forces could be observed in Belarus, but it was much smaller than the force which piled into northern Ukraine last February. Nevertheless, a Russian offensive was possible and a push into West Ukraine could jeopardize supply lines of weapons from Europe, he added. Serhiy Nayev, commander of Ukraine's joint forces, said Ukraine had enough troops to defend the current threat and would match any increases on the other side of the border if needed. Local Ukrainian commanders said there were 15,000 Russian troops in Belarus, too few to launch a major offensive. There has been a slew of military activity for months in Belarus, ranging from joint exercises to the establishment of a joint regional Belarusian-Russian military force. Russian President Vladimir Putin visited Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko in December in a rare trip to Minsk, prompting speculation it preceded an attack on Ukraine, possibly with the direct involvement of the Belarusian army, even though Minsk has said it will not enter the war. Muzyka put the chances of Belarus joining on Russia's side at 50-50, noting the intensity of the military training exercises there was the highest since the Cold War. Belarus could send 100,000 to 200,000 conscripts to the war, but its dated equipment would not provide new capabilities, he added. Russian President Vladimir Putin demoted the commander leading his troops in Ukraine to a deputy role after serving in the top job for only 3 months, Russia's defense ministry said Wednesday. General Valery Gerasimov will take over for Sergei Surovikin after the former commander was handed sole charge over the brutal campaign in October, a move Moscow said is an attempt to diversify roles and increase lines of communication. In this picture taken on December 28, 2017, Russian President Vladimir Putin presents an award to Colonel General Sergei Surovikin, the commander of Russian troops in Syria, during a ceremony to bestow state awards on military personnel who fought in Syria, at the Kremlin in Moscow. Surovikin will now serve alongside Army General Oleg Salyakov and Colonel General Alexei Kim as deputies in a new, joint group that will work on organizing closer cooperation between the types and branches of the armed forces, Ukrainian news outlet Pravda said. The news followed directives issued by Putin in December when he called on his top brass to coordinate more closely with regional heads in occupied areas of Ukraine to better outfit troops and provide specific needs based on those lines of communication. Surovikin, who has been championed by Moscow for his military successes during the Second Chechen War and in Syria, was appointed after Russia lost Kharkiv when Ukrainian troops forced their withdrawal. Under Surovikin, Russia launched a massive aerial campaign against Ukrainian civilians and targeted the nation's energy infrastructure, a tactic that Western defense officials said Russia would be unable to sustain and which has recently faltered. The Russian withdrawal from Kherson and subsequent losses and stalled efforts in Donetsk also ensued under Surovikin, despite intense ground warfare in areas like Bakhmut and recently Soledar. Ukrainian soldiers work with Payan artillery in the northern direction of the Donbass frontline as Russia-Ukraine war continues in Donetsk, Ukraine on January 7, 2023. Kyiv has been sounding the alarm for weeks that Russia is planning a major offensive in an attempt to turn the tide in Ukraine, and NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg on Wednesday urged member nations to send more vital military aid to counter whatever Russia is planning. Neither NATO officials nor the US have described what Russia may be planning, though Ukraine has claimed its intelligence believes another round of mass conscription is on the horizon as Russia looks to make gains in Ukraine. The US-based Institute for the Study of War has also reported that despite false Russian media claims, Russian forces and Wagner Group mercenaries have struggled to gain tactical control of the entire city, and even if they did so, it won't necessarily lead to the surrounding of Bakhmut. Bakhmut and Soledar remain the hottest spots at the front line at this time. Russian invading forces claimed they had complete control of Soledar on January 8. The Ukrainian military denied that the Russians had managed to capture the entire city. On the same day, Deputy Minister of Defense Hanna Maliar said that while it was really hard in the city, Ukrainian troops had nevertheless managed to make small gains on some parts of the front line there. The commander of Ukraine's ground forces, Colonel General Alexander Syrsky, recently visited the frontline positions of Ukrainian troops in Soledar and Bakhmut, Donetsk Oblast, and discussed the situation with their commanders. Soledar is located about 13 kilometers to the northeast from Bakhmut. It is another town in the east of Ukraine almost completely destroyed by the occupying forces during their numerous attempts to seize it over the past several months. The population of the town before the full-scale invasion was 11,000 citizens, most of whom have fled. Regular artillery shelling from the very start of the invasion has left Soledar largely deserted. Artemsil, the largest salt factory in Europe, is located in the town, but it has not been operating since April 2022. Soledar was a relatively unremarkable city in the eastern region of Donetsk before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The name literally translates as "gift of salt," and it is the location of the largest salt mines in Europe. Now those mines serve as defensive positions for Ukraine's embattled military. Serhiy Cherevity, a spokesperson for Ukraine's Eastern Military Command, further disputed Russian claims that Soledar was completely under Russian control. Ukrainian soldiers published footage of themselves still occupying positions in the west of the city this morning, using commercial drones to monitor the advancing Russian forces. Igor Girkin, a former colonel in Russia's Federal Security Service, FSB, who was convicted in absentia by a Dutch court of murder in the downing of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 in 2014, denied that Soledar had either been captured or encircled by Russian forces. With white snow above and white mineral below Soledar, the battle for this small town of just 10,000 inhabitants is entering its fifth month, mainly as a sideshow or preliminary to the bigger push to take the northeast city of Bakhmut to the south. For the Kremlin, taking Soledar would cut off Ukrainian resupplies to Bakhmut and help encircle it. Bakhmut affords an easier line of attack for the Russians against the larger cities of Kramatorsk, a major industrial center, and Ukraine's administration headquarters in Donetsk, and Slovyansk, which lies close to the M03 highway connecting Kyiv to Kharkiv. Wagner fighters have deployed to Syria to prop up Bashar Assad's regime in exchange for lucrative oil contracts. They've fought against a United Nations-recognized government in Libya. And they've fought rebel groups in both the Central African Republic and Mali, where they've been accused of massacring civilians. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine foundered last spring, Prigozhin has begun to position himself both as a critic of Russia's formal military establishment and the war's prospective savior. He publicly revealed himself as the backer of Wagner in a string of public appearances, an allegation he had previously long denied, even to the point of filing civil litigation against those making it. Prigozhin has persuaded thousands of hardened criminals from Russia's prisons to sign up for a 6-month tour of duty with Wagner in exchange for a pardon. He left no illusions as to the meat grinder that faced the convicts. They were about to enter hell, he reportedly told them, but the assignment could be their lucky ticket out of jail. Of some 50,000 Wagner mercenaries, the U.S. estimates 4,100 have been killed and another 10,000 injured on the battlefield. A 28% casualty rate would be unsustainable for any normal military organization with concern for the morale and well-being of its personnel. The European Union is prepared for a long war in Ukraine and will support Kiev against Russia's aggression as long as it takes, Sweden's Foreign Minister Tobias Billström, whose country holds the EU's presidency, said on Wednesday. Despite Russia's continued attempts to divide us, unity within the EU and across the Atlantic has been strong. The EU is prepared for a long war and will continue to stand by Ukraine's side with political, economic, military, and humanitarian support for as long as it takes. He said the EU would continue working on more sanctions against Moscow over the invasion of Ukraine after 9 packages of measures passed by the 27-nation bloc since the start of the invasion in February 2022. Officials said new sanctions could include more asset freezes and travel bans on Russian individuals involved in the war and more restrictions on sales to Russia of EU goods that could be used for military purposes. The EU stands ready to continue to reinforce the sanctions, to ensure an effective and coherent implementation of the sanctions and also to prevent their circumvention by Russia.